Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to today's US PAC Business Leadership Series webinar. My name is Smiley Pozwalski, your moderator for today's discussion. We're just going to wait another 2 or 3 minutes for folks to join before we get started. To those of you that are just joining, we're just waiting another 2 or 3 minutes for folks to join before we get started. All right, welcome everyone to today's US PAC Business Leadership Series webinar on the best and worst practices of sales management. My name is Smiley Pozwalski. I'm your moderator for today's discussion with Jason Jordan, who is a partner at Vantage Performance. Before we get started with Jason, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Smiley. I am a millennial workplace expert and the author of The Quarter Life Breakthrough, which is a career guide for millennials to find meaningful work. So I'm very excited about this topic of sales management because I meet a lot of millennials and people that are just starting their careers or navigating their career paths that are interested in sales or working in sales and trying to figure out how to do that work better, how to rise in their career, to get promoted, to manage people, to better reach their customers, and to be in a more people-centric workplace. So we're very excited to have Jason Jordan with us today for a webinar on the best and worst practices of sales management. Jason is a recognized thought leader in B2B selling and conducts ongoing research into the management and best practices of world-class sales forces. His extensive research into sales performance led to the breakthrough insights published in the book Cracking the Sales Management Code, which was published by McGraw-Hill in 2012. For 20 years, Jason has worked internationally in industries such as tech, manufacturing, distribution, financial services, consumer products, healthcare, and hospitality. He's a popular speaker and writer and a frequent contributor to the Sales Management Association, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Entrepreneur, Salesforce.com, and other industry groups. He's a passionate advocate for the sales profession and the evolution of sales into a science, and he's been the director of research for the Sales Education Foundation, as well as a visiting faculty member in the executive education and MBA programs at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. He received his economics degree with honors from Duke University and an MBA from the University of Virginia. He and his family currently reside in Charlottesville, Virginia. So let's give a warm welcome to Jason Jordan from Vantage Performance.
Thank you, Smiley. I appreciate the grand introduction. I am really happy to be with you today, and also really happy to be discussing this research, this topic. So we, as Smiley said, I'm a partner with a company called Vantage Performance. I'm not going to show you any slides on our company, but let me just tell you what we do to give you some context. So we train sales managers and sales leaders. So we're a sales training company, basically, but we focus on one specific role, which is the management layer. And so consequently, we do a lot of research into sales management best practices. Along the way, we learn some bad practices, and we publish tons of stuff. So I'd encourage you to visit our website, vantagepointperformance.com, if you're interested in sales management topic. There's just loads of research and resources there. We tried to make that website very valuable. But today I want to talk about one specific research project that we did, and some of the interesting insights that came out of it. Is my screen sharing? Weird. Sorry about this. So the research that we did was in collaboration with a company called Chally Worldwide, and they are an assessment company. They assess salespeople, and so they had this really fascinating methodology that they used to get here. Their team of researchers interviewed 2,500 business-to-business buyers, and so what they would do generally is call up a buyer in a company and say, hey, do you purchase office products? And they'd say yes. They'd say, well, do you mind giving us a few minutes to talk about the vendors? So they literally interviewed 2,500 buyers in the business-to-business space and collected data on 4,500 salespeople from 1,500 companies. Because of course, every business-to-business buyer had several salespeople calling on them. So it's the size of this study is really remarkable. And so they asked the buyers to basically rate the sales forces or the salespeople that called on them on 15 criteria, and the finalists had to be nominated by at least 20 businesses. So it was pretty rigorous process they went through. So they ended up with 140 finalists, sorted it into 16 market segments, and only 4 were selected or deemed world-class by their customers. And I think this is fascinating because they weren't looking for the companies that had the greatest revenue growth. They weren't looking for market leaders in product sets. They weren't looking for anything other than their customers' opinion of them. And I think that's the way we should judge our sales forces and our salespeople, is by what the customers think. Because you can buy for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to share some of that with you. So this is a pretty massive research project to identify the 4 companies that were at the top of the list. And then we interviewed people all across these companies. We interviewed the CIOs, obviously the chief sales officers, human resources, IT. So we really went to the top of these 4 organizations and asked a lot of questions, and even shadowed some of the sales teams just to see exactly what was going on that separated them from the rest. And so the research I'm going to show here is going to basically demonstrate what we found to be unique about their particular sales forces. But just some high-level observations, because I find this so fascinating. So here are the way that the 16 industries ranked. And if you look at this, and I'm sure you're very quickly trying to find your position, your position in this ranking, it's kind of interesting that the companies like software companies or pharmaceuticals, which have, or even telecom, if you include computing in that, they are industries that have high growth, high profitability. They invest substantially in their sales teams, and yet the companies at the top of this list find paper, business services, maintenance, repair, parts, original equipment, auto parts, office supplies, chemicals, rubber. I mean, these are commodity items, and that leads to an interesting insight, which is that the more the product or service was commoditized, the better the sales force seemed to be. And it seems counterintuitive, but if you think about it, if you're selling Microsoft Office, and you have a 90% market share, you don't have to sell too hard. But if you're selling paper and you have 5 competitors and they also have paper, then really the sales effort is what differentiates them. And so we found that the more commoditized industries actually had better salespeople. And the effectiveness of the salesperson didn't seem to correlate with compensation or the prestige of the industry, right? So semiconductors and such. It was really, as I said, came down to the way the product and the organization was structured. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But the industries that dominated by a single major competitor ranked much lower. I mentioned software like Microsoft or Oracle, But also, I mean, if you have a cable company that's basically has a monopoly on your house, you can, we all feel what happens when someone basically owns the market. And the most interesting thing I think about this was all four winners, and I'm going to tell you them who they were next, were resellers of other companies' products. They were distributors or resellers, all four of them. And it's interesting to think about that because a distributor or reseller doesn't have to concern themselves with manufacturing and a lot of the things that the full service companies, I guess is a way to say it, do. People that resell or distributors, they're basically a sales force. That's where the value is added. I mean, inventory and financing as well. But it's interesting that none of the people who won this award were actually producing anything. And so the winners were Global Imaging Systems, which sells basically copiers and office equipment. Applied Industrial Technologies, which is a reseller of basically MRO. So they would compete with Grainger, right? They have millions of SKUs they sell, reselling, again, other people's products into industrial applications. Corporate Express, which sells office products. And Insight Computing, which is a reseller of computers. And it's interesting, since we've done the research, Global Imaging was acquired by Xerox and Corporate Express was acquired by Staples. And so, companies that do manufacture things and do, have a more sophisticated and deep value chain really see the value in companies that have a sophisticated and effective sales capability. So what I'm going to do is give you a little more research and then get straight into some of the practices we found that made the big difference. One thing that I will note here, it's kind of interesting research as well. They pulled out the 4 factors that determined the customer's overall satisfaction with their sales force that was calling on them, and it was kind of interesting. So price, which everyone focuses on price. If you have a sales force, a salesperson will say they lose deals over price all the time. It was really only 18% of the customers said that that was a key driver of satisfaction. Quality of the product or service, only 21%. And products and services don't stay differentiated very long. People follow quite quickly. The value of the solution, 22. But the punchline here is that in a business-to-business sale, in this research of thousands of companies and thousands of buyers, the most important thing in the sale was the quality of the salesperson. And again, I think that gets to the idea that products, become quickly commoditized, and the salesperson really is the experience that a buyer has. So it's not price, it's not even the product, it's really the salesperson in these types of environments. I'm going to move along here. So I'm going to talk about a few areas today where we found some interesting practices. One is a customer-driven culture. The second is in recruiting salespeople. The third, right after recruiting, becomes talent training and development. Information technology. So let me start with a customer-driven culture. So the way this is going to work out is I'm going to talk about common industry practice, and then I'm going to talk about the best practices that we uncovered. So when most companies go to hire into their sales force, they'll look for industry experience. And that's kind of another way of saying that the salesperson will be familiar with the customers, familiar with the products probably. And so salesperson experience being relevant in the industry, particularly with the customers, seems to be one of the key drivers. But what we found is these really extraordinary companies actually spend a lot of time trying to teach the salespeople about their customers. And this is kind of interesting. So they teach them about the customer's business, how it operates. They teach them about their customer issues, their problem solved. They talk about the needs that the customers have that bring them to them. And so where most companies kind of rely on a person's industry experience, these companies actually had customer training. And I think if you look at your training agenda, you'll probably see sales skill training, you'll probably see product training. I don't know how many people have customer training, but Global Imaging did. And so in this case, all of their employees, when they came on board, received a day and a half of training on customers. Again, the drivers that brought customers to them. And so think about this, when someone comes on board, they spend a day and a half getting trained about their customers. It's just not something that you would see in a lot of sales forces. And here's a quote from Dan Cooper, who was at the time the SVP of sales. "We teach our salespeople the buying process rather than the selling process." It's very insightful. We want them to understand the sales cycle from the buyer standpoint, not ours, because in the end, what we're trying to do is advance their buying process, not our selling process. And so if you're not doing anything to train your salespeople on the customers and the needs that you solve and how they buy, I think this is a pretty thought-provoking insight that top sales organizations aren't focused on the selling process, they're focused on the buying process. Let me talk about one more thing we found with on the customer side. So every sales force is trying to create value for their customers, right? I mean, that's what you're basically doing, is you're selling a product or service in exchange for money, and they give you that money because they think there's greater value in what they're purchasing. And so we talk a lot about creating value for the buyer, but there's an interesting thing about these top sales forces and what they did differently. They went as far as to try to demonstrate that they had created value for the customer. So they didn't sell the customer products and walk away and assume that the customer was going to find the value in those products. They actually stayed with the customers and tried to calculate the cost benefit and the business impact that their product had. So they were basically taking information from the customers, doing an ROI calculation and feeding it back to the buyers to demonstrate that they had created value. And this example is so brilliant. So this comes from Applied Industrial Technologies. They had a process called DVA, or Documented Value Added. And it was basically a PC-based system, obviously, that would calculate the value they created for their customers. So the salespeople or even the service people could collect data from the customers and then plug it into the system to speak back to the customers about how much value they created. And so this is such a true quote here from Ted Carl, who's the VP of Strategic Accounts. He said, "Too often customers simply don't remember all the good things you do. It's fun to go to the customer and say, hey, you bought $200,000 of stuff from us last year, but you got $85,000 in value that we documented, and again, they got the data from the customer, so it was unassailable." He said it takes the sting out of a price increase, or when you get a lower competitive bid. Basically, they'll stick with you because it's conveying to the customer in terms they understand what's being done for them. And so you can start to see, I mean, if you think about how you demonstrate value for your customers, it's most probably done during the sales process. And if you have ongoing relationships with the people that you sell to, I think it's an interesting idea to think about going to them and helping them build a business case that proves how valuable you are for them. It's just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So let's talk about recruiting. The biggest line item you'll find in your sales force is obviously compensation, and people spend a lot of time on incentive compensation. And so who you hire and how you set them up for success is very important. And so common practice, especially historically, this is changing a little bit now, but historically when we think about hiring salespeople, we think about kind of that natural born seller, right? A person with a fire in the belly who's aggressive and resilient and persuasive. And it's kind of like if you see a salesperson, you know it, right? And heads of sales would say they can tell within the first 15 seconds whether they're going to hire someone, whether they'll be a great salesperson. And that may have worked in the old days, but sales forces are extremely sophisticated now. The sales process is broken into pieces, right? You might have someone doing prospecting, someone qualifying, and then someone else even following up on the deal. And maybe there are teams involved in the sales. You have technical specialists, and you have an account manager, and you have a strategic this, and a VP, and so what we found that the more sophisticated and more successful sales forces did was really think about their sales force in terms of specialties. And so this map here is actually a map of roles that Chally, the partner that we did this research with, uses. And it's interesting. So they say, outside field sales is different than inside sales. And if you're in the field, an indirect sales role who sells through distributors is different than a direct sales role. And if you're in a direct sales role, if you sell a full line of products, that's different than if you specialize in certain types of products. And if you sell a full line of products, it's different if you are a strategic account manager and have 1 or 2 or 3 accounts versus a territory manager where you may have 200 accounts. And so basically it starts to build this picture that there's not a salesperson who's a good salesperson. In fact, someone may be in an outside sales role and fail miserably. It doesn't mean you have to fire them. They might succeed greatly in an inbound telesales environment. And so this idea, again, that there's a right personality type for sales is something that we really need to bash and to dispel, because sales is a very rich profession. There are a lot of different roles, and there's probably a place for everyone to succeed. So when you are thinking about hiring, think about the distinctions in the roles that you hire too, and be very specific about who you're hiring and where you're placing them, because it will have a huge impact on how successful they are as a person. So once you hire these folks, you're going to train and develop them. And I said the #1 line item on a Salesforce's expense sheet is going to certainly be compensation, but in a lot of places, training is right behind it. And so we spend a lot of money, or should spend a lot of money training and developing salespeople, but there are a couple examples here we'll point out that we don't always do it right. So a common practice is to train extensively at onboarding, right? So someone comes on board, a new salesperson, maybe you stick them in a room for a day and a half and teach them about customers. You're doing a lot of product education, you're doing a lot of HR stuff, or maybe it's intermittent, right? Maybe everyone gets together once a year and there's a big training session, or even worse for us, because since we're a training company, it's done every 3 to 4 years. And so what we saw, interestingly, was that these companies didn't have huge training events. They had small training events, and they would basically feed people information as they needed it. So one of the companies said, look, when we hire someone, we don't teach them how to enter an order into the system because our sales cycle is 6 to 12 months. They won't need that information until they sell something. We teach them how to prospect and how to talk at the front end of the sales cycle. And so basically they were just kind of feeding in little pieces the salespeople the skills that they need when they needed them, rather than bringing them on board and trying to teach them everything at once. And that's where you see all the knowledge fall off. So insight computing, I'll talk about here. So they were redesigning their training modules for new hires, and they realized that traditional orientation tactics were just kind of silly. And again, bringing in a big group of people, training them on every aspect of their job, and then sending them into the field. So they adopted what we considered, anyway, a more targeted, just-in-time approach to training. And again, as I said, actually, this was the company I was giving an example. So they would hire people and they wouldn't teach them how to put in orders until they had been there for 6 months because they wouldn't need it. And when you're feeding people skills just as they need them, then they're immediately using them and reinforcing it. And so, this is Julie Durbin, I believe. Anyway, it says a key element in designing the new curriculum was to reconsider the timing when they received it. We timed the training to correlate when they'd actually need the knowledge. Yeah, Julie Durbin. For example, reporting, they've not generated any revenue. And not a lot of activity, there's nothing to report. So they placed the training and the curriculum where it made sense. So obviously they had a multi-year training track for these people, and it was a huge and significant investment, taking people out of the field constantly, and now they're doing it a little more efficiently. They're engaging kind of distance learning. But this idea that we bring people in periodically and pump them full of knowledge is a little outdated. I give you one more thing that I'll say here about training and development. If you have sales managers that I don't know your companies, but if you have sales managers, I would predict that this is how that happened. They were successful salespeople, and then they were promoted to sales managers, and that probably ended the degree of training that they received. Sales managers will often get some leadership training, maybe coaching on a very generic kind of coaching model. But generally, we take our best salespeople, we promote them to be manager, and we assume that that's going to be sufficient, right? They were successful salespeople. Surely they can manage salespeople and make all of them successful. But our research also shows that only 52% of business-to-business salespeople are making their quotas. So clearly, that assumption is not playing out, or else we'd have much better numbers there. And this is a little self-serving because we train sales managers, but we did find that these top companies had a real focus on developing the sales force, the sales management team. So when they were a salesperson, they got trained on selling skills and how to use the technology and all those things. But when they were promoted to manager, it was almost like they were new hires. Right? So when they promoted them to a different role, they treated them as though they were new to the role, which they were. And they had substantial investment in the managers, which paid substantial dividends. And back to insight computing, they were rolling out a sales training program, and they found that there was very inconsistent oversight by the sales managers. And the existing managers basically coached the direct reports using their own philosophies, processes, tools. So they very typically had deployed a very rigid sales process that they wanted their salespeople to follow, but they didn't attend to the sales managers. And so the sales managers are basically just, depending on their disposition and their skill set, kind of doing their own thing. And they further found that not all the managers were supportive of the new sales strategy, the new sales process. And it wasn't that they actually refused it. A lot of people didn't understand it. They didn't understand the context and why it was there. And I can promise you, if your frontline managers don't buy into a change, whether it's CRM or a sales process or skill training, if the frontline managers don't buy into it, it's dead on arrival. So they designed and implemented a companion program for the sales managers to make sure that they were aware of what the salespeople should be doing, but more importantly, aware of their role in the process. And this focus on sales management really can't be overemphasized, again, particularly in any kind of change effort. They'll make the change happen, or there'll be a barrier to the change. Those are the two options. And when you invest in them, good things happen. So talk about information technology for a little bit. I mean, the sales force is just inundated with technology at this point. You know, CRM came along in the 90s, and now there's CRM. Now CRM is just infrastructure, everyone has it. But then all kinds of other tools. When the internet came into being, right? We have apps. There's so much technology in the sales force today that it's almost impossible to run your sales force without it. But let's talk about CRM for a second. As I said, it's kind of table stakes now. Everyone can have a CRM tool, and everyone should. Otherwise, it's going to fall back to Excel, which is probably the most, probably the biggest CRM tool in the world is Excel. But what a typical sales force will do if they're smart is they'll buy, what they consider to be the best of breed CRM, right? So whichever is the hottest CRM, it used to be Siebel, then Oracle, then SAP, now Salesforce.com is the market leader. And what they'll do is they'll assume that since these are kind of best practice tools, that they have the best practices of sales embedded in them. And I can't tell you how often I see sales forces that have CRM tools that really aren't very customized to the way that they sell. I mean, they made the assumption that Salesforce.com had figured it out for them. What we found with these companies is that they didn't consider technology the strategy. They didn't consider technology to lead in the change effort. They were really more focused on the business. And they began by defining the sales processes that they wanted, or other business processes they needed the salespeople to engage in. And then they asked what functionality from a technical perspective they needed to support it. So not beginning with the technology and bending the business to it, beginning with the business and bending technology to it. And that's when you find that people are actually more engaged with the technology. The user adoption is higher because they see clearly how it supports their everyday business. And I love this example from Corporate Express. So Corporate Express had begun to implement Salesforce, and they had a bunch of existing sales processes that they were very happy with. Right, they'd spent a lot of time investing in kind of the roles of inside salespeople, outside salespeople, technical support. So a lot of roles. They'd done a lot of work on getting their activities defined and codified, and they didn't want to upset it by implementing technology that basically didn't fit the way they were selling. So the internal developers mapped out the technology and to the business model, developed customized reports, etc. And so Donna said, kind of interestingly, she said, Corporate Express customized all of our processes, then we matched them in Salesforce.com. And it's a small thing, but it's a big thing. I've been called in to work on kind of RFP stuff when companies are trying to buy CRM, and I've surely worked on plenty of CRM implementations, and it's pretty logical to start bending the company to the tool, not vice versa, because there's expense in customizing tools. But it's the only way to really integrate technology into the Salesforce is to start with the Salesforce and then map the technology. Another thing we see is kind of large-scale implementations of CRM. So we'll basically decide we need a new system. We'll do a massive requirements definition project and define what we want everything to do. And then we'll spend a year or years in some cases kind of developing it, customizing it, testing, piloting, and then eventually this massive piece of technology gets rolled out. And obviously, if it's a massively large system, it's massively disruptive. And then you have all kinds of training issues, and people aren't adopting it, people reject it. What we saw with these companies, at least in 3 of them, was that they really avoided kind of big bang system development, as I'll call it. They basically would recognize the need for functionality, and then they'd develop or purchase some incremental piece of software, and then they'd get rapid adoption, right? So one example would be salespeople would be complaining about difficulty finding SKUs in the system. So they'd go to develop an app to help them find SKUs, and immediately they would use it, and immediately it would be adopted, and immediately there was value. They really shied away from these large-scale implementations, and this is just applied industrial technologies. I remember this conversation so clearly. So this is a $2 billion company, and they had no formal CRM. Literally, they didn't have Salesforce.com, they didn't have Oracle, they didn't have anything. Basically, the primary form of customer information sharing was this really highly developed email system that had all kinds of tags and things going on in the background. It's really quite fascinating, actually. And it was connected through account numbers. So anytime they sent an email regarding a customer, there would be an account number, and the system would basically compile those, and that became the database of customer interactions and customer and customer strategy. And so here's what the CIO said. They said, we never implemented any packaged systems because they weren't architected to the way that we do business. We never pushed anything on our salespeople. We just responded to their requests for additional functionality. And what started out as a series of quick fixes ended up being a full-blown system. And in fact, Jim said he would be kind of embarrassed for some of his peers from other companies to come in and see what they had, because the peers were spending millions and millions of dollars on these large-scale sophisticated tools. And basically, they just had a patchwork of apps that they had developed. But the sales team loved it. The customers loved it because it was running a lot of stuff on the back end of the website. We don't have to implement things in a big fashion to get big impact. What I always tell people when they're looking at CRM tools is, buy it, fine. But what you want to do is start with as little functionality as you can get away with. Maybe you implement it as almost as a contact management database so that salespeople can manage the relationships, and then start adding in other things like pricing, and then start adding in other things like, I don't even know, product configuration. But start with the basics and add the pieces as they're needed in incremental fashion. It's almost the same idea as training in small bite-sized pieces over time, rather than a big bang training program. But again, the CIO was funny about it. He said he just would be fearful if someone else came in and saw what they had developed, but the sales team absolutely loved it. So let me just sum up here, and then we'll take some questions. I'm sure Smiley's been gathering some as I've been rambling on. There's common practice and there's best practice, and I think we often confuse the two. The most obvious and intuitive path isn't always the best. It makes sense to have big training programs when people come on board. It makes sense to take our best salespeople and promote them to manager. It makes sense to buy these big systems and spend a lot of time and invest a lot of money in getting it right the first time and rolling it out all at once. But in reality, the best sales forces are doing exactly the opposite. So I hesitate to say that they're worst practices, the common practices that I discussed, but they're not great, and there's definitely a better way to do it. The other thing I found in the research, and I mentioned this up front, is the harder something is to sell, right? So it's commoditized, the better the salespeople become, and it's by necessity. If I'm reselling Dell computers and someone else is also reselling Dell computers, the customer's going to buy a Dell computer. The question is, who are they going to buy it from? And if I, as a salesperson, don't add value, then there's another option. And so it's kind of interesting that the more commoditized things were, the better the sales team was. And the harder something is to manage, the more rigor is needed. It's almost like when we encounter management issues and they get hard, we try to dodge them one way or the other. But sales management is hard, and it's easier to have one big training program when someone comes on board once a year than it is to have a sales training company or sales training resources internally continually training and continually pulling people out of the field. But the harder it is, oftentimes the more you need it. And then the theme here from the beginning to end has been kind of start with the customer need. Identify the business need and identify the management approach. And by customer need, I mean obviously your customers who buy your products. But if you're running CRM, then your customers are the salespeople. If you're a manager, the salespeople are your customers. And so this idea of really thinking through the person on the other side of the transaction, whether it's a paying customer or whether it's a salesperson using your technology, start with them and identify what the business need is, and then build the tools, build the processes, build the training, build it around that. And again, it's easier to just go to the market and try to find some training and run it, but it's better to really be thoughtful about how you're identifying it and how you're rolling it out. So Smiley, that was a little bit of a sprint. Why don't I pause for a second and let you react, or if there's some questions, I'd love to take those as well.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was very, very insightful, very interesting to me as someone that, in my work, I meet a lot of young people that are navigating their careers, a lot of millennials that are kind of joining the workplace or work in sales and kind of early talent type of roles. And I'm always interested to hear these kind of non-intuitive best practices, right? What everyone thinks is actually the right thing might actually be the worst thing. A couple of things I wanted to ask, just because of my angle into this, which is generations in the workplace and kind of the future of work, is have you noticed any differences about what millennials that are joining the sales force are looking for? In my research, I find a lot of people early talent, and this is true for both Gen Z and millennials, are looking really, the primary driver for their work is not just money, is also purpose and meaning in their work. Um, and how are they finding that in sales roles, and how are companies able to give that to them, whether it's through training, through learning and development, professional development opportunities, letting them experience other parts of the company. Have you seen companies or specific examples that are training new talent in sales very well, and what specifically are they doing?
Sure. Well, we train sales managers, and millennials are just starting to get into that level of the organizations. We're seeing more and more of them. Obviously, if people are getting promoted into management in their late 20s, early 30s, maybe even 40s, and so we do see a couple of differences. One is they're a lot more acclimated to technology. So I think sometimes change is easier on younger people, just because they've grown up in a different world where things aren't static and you're constantly changing your app and you're constantly doing things. So I think there's that. But probably the most interesting discussions I've had with millennials is there's kind of this assumption that they're all electronic all the time, and that they need their independence. And what we've discovered is that millennials in many ways aren't that different, and they expect people to coach and develop them. And one person said to me that he was managing a team of millennials, and he kind of assumed they just wanted emails and they just wanted to kind of chat and text. And he said it really, the relationships he developed and the talent that they had really stepped up when he started meeting face to face with them, and the millennials loved it. And so it's counterintuitive, because we think these people live in a virtual world and that's where they want to exist, but they do more than the older generations, it appears, want training, and they expect it as a part of their career development, and they like coaching, and they don't like it in an impersonal way. They like it in the exact same way that 65-year-olds like it, which is in a personal fashion, face to face. So there are some differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. I think we often overstate the differences, honestly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I find that in my research as well. The importance of, in the digital world, we talk about digital natives, and this next generation obviously is very fluent with technology, and that's part of the work, but that isn't the work in and of itself. Actually, what people are craving is the in-person connection, the face-to-face connection, the mentorship that comes with pairing someone that has a lot of experience in sales and a lot of management experience with someone that's up and coming, right?
Yeah.
And not just assuming that, okay, everything's online, all the resources are there. We have these tools, we have these 15 different ways we can communicate that don't involve us being in the same place. Fine. If you really want to mentor that person, you should have coffee with them, which is about as much of an old school management practice as there is.
Yeah.
So we have some. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, technology enables a higher volume of lower value interactions.
Right.
Sometimes just fewer higher value interactions.
We have some great questions coming in. A couple little ones here. Do your findings differ for smaller companies, and do you have a favorite? You mentioned a bunch of CRMs, but a favorite platform, or does it depend on the specific needs of the business?
Yep. So the second question is one I get a lot. So let me put that on hold for a second. So the first question was, or the first part of the question was about size of the company, and I don't think any. I think some of these truths are just universal. Big implementations are disruptive, maybe even more disruptive for small companies, because they're not used to change in that way. The salespeople need to sell, and technology needs to support it, and the training needs to support it when they need it. So I think small companies face resource issues, and in some ways, maybe some of these practices are adopted out of necessity, right? They don't implement multi-million-dollar software; they implement pieces at a time. But I don't think there's any difference. And with the second one, with regard to CRM, and I get asked this a lot, because the book Cracking the Sales Management Code that you mentioned is really a study of management reports. So many people consider me, someone in the know on CRM and reporting, which is true. And if you took most CRM packages and took the name off and put them next to each other, it'd be hard to tell a difference. They all pretty much perform the same function. And so I think that it's not as important what the software is as to how it's architected. And again, it needs to begin with the sales activities and the sales processes, and then it needs to kind of blend into that, not the opposite. So certainly there are packages that are cheaper than others. There are some that are more sophisticated, but not everyone needs a sophisticated CRM tool. In fact, a lot of the functionality is lost in them. So technology is an enabler, just like training, and that's the way I treat it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Here's another question that was, it prefaces by saying we were shocked to see this information in your research with technology companies at the bottom of the rating. So in summary, do you say that the salespeople are the #1 source for improving sales? What are your extended thoughts?
Well, as I said, the more differentiated the product is, the easier it is to sell. And that should be the point. I mean, I think we should try to differentiate our products and differentiate our company. But it just makes it's not as hard a task as selling something. The person next to you selling exactly the same thing. And, technology companies are very differentiated, I think, when compared to rubber, right, or paper. And so I think there's an extra challenge there when you got your marketing team working on the products and developing them and the messaging to the marketplace. I think the issue is to really focus on the salespeople themselves. I don't think there's anything better than going to the market and just getting some customer feedback on their experience with your salespeople, with other salespeople. If you're not doing kind of post-deal evaluations with your prospects and customers, you're missing something. A lot of people will go if they lose a deal and interview the customer and try to find out what they did wrong. But when you win a deal, you should do that as well. I mean, I think some of our greatest insights as a sales team have come from interviewing people that did buy from us, because they are very able to articulate what your value is to them. So it is counterintuitive. As I said, it's one of my favorite things out of this research was the lens on the fact that the best sales forces are distributors and resellers, because that's what they do. I mean, they hire and deploy salespeople into the field. They're not distracted by product development, and the more commoditized the product, the bigger the challenge it is to sell. It's counterintuitive, but insightful once you think about it.
Yeah. Another question is, how did you calculate the DVA values, and what kind of factors were taken into consideration, pricing, etc.?
Right. So, well, we didn't do the calculation, but the way the company did it was basically, so they say they're selling into a manufacturing environment, and they're selling gaskets. I'm making this example up, but I think it's one they shared with me. They would go interview the plant manager and talk about downtime before and downtime after. How many stoppages of production did they have, and how often did they have to replace the gaskets? I mean, they basically got into the business operations and tried to identify where their product had made a difference. And that's why people buy gaskets, right? Because the other ones wear out, and if you can sell them a better product and there's less downtime, then there's value there. So it was literally taking operational data from people on the ground in those manufacturing facilities and trying to piece together a business case for buying from them again, maybe even at a premium.
Okay, and we have one more here. Is what are the best interview questions to evaluate a good sales manager?
Oh, that's a good one. There was some research. There was some stuff in here on interviewing, and I didn't have time to put it in. This is not really what we do. We train managers. We don't hire them. But what the research showed was interviewing itself is pretty is not that high impact. I think the research that Charlie had and some other research I've seen shows that if you just do a structured interview, your success rate's probably a little over 50%, a little better than flipping a coin. And what these companies did in the hiring was they came at it from a bunch of different angles. So one company specifically would obviously interview the salespeople and go to a very structured interview. But they'd also, once they got to a certain point in the process, they'd let them ride around with other salespeople in the field for a day, and let them get a sense of what the sales role was, and get feedback from the salesperson as to whether that person is the right fit for the role. Obviously reference checks, which you'd be surprised how many people don't do really high quality reference checks because it's hard. And then testing. Charlie is an assessment tool for salespeople, and so when you combine all those things, when you do the right interviews and you have people kind of do on the job shadowing, and you use assessment tools, the success rate goes up to over 60%. And even that doesn't sound like a big difference, but it is. If you can go from 50 to 65% in success rate with your salespeople and sales managers, then you've done a good thing.
That's really helpful. One more here. What action steps would you recommend for sales managers who are struggling to implement change but don't feel they have the support from upper management?
Oh, well, this is the worst. I mean, I used to be a management consultant. Now we do training, which is a little different, but kind of working toward the same outcomes. And so invariably we do a consulting project, whatever it was, some kind of change, and we go back 6 months later, and I'd ask the head of sales. I'd say, how did it go? And the head of sales every time would say, well, it went pretty well in this region. Over here, it didn't really take. And I'd say, well, what was the difference? And he'd say, well, in this region, the VP of sales was really behind it. The RVP was on board and really drove it and made it a priority. And over here, it was like number 4 priority that never got any attention. And so if your senior leadership is not into the change, then you're going to fight a lot. You're going to fight for resources. You're going to fight for a share of mind. You're going to fight for it's hard. But what I will say is that the sales management layer is where the change happens. And so, through coaching, I mean, sales managers are basically like in-field trainers, right? So they're developing their salespeople, they're identifying, they're assessing their skill set. So, if you don't have senior leadership's endorsement, then it's going to be hard. But as a frontline sales manager, there's enormous power in the interactions that you have with your salespeople and the way that you talk to them and the example that you set, whether it's using CRM or demonstrating skills from a training program. So it's hard, but not impossible. Sales managers have more power than they often realize.
That's great. I think that's the last question we have. Do you have anything else? Oh, one more here. What do you think about compensation and sales commission? How do you compare that to training opportunities that salespeople could get from their organization?
So I've done a lot of sales incentive work, sales incentive compensation design, and it's important. But kind of the problems that I see with incentive compensation are that it often becomes overly complex. So incentive compensation should do 2 things. It should motivate the right behaviors and reward successful outcomes. What we often see is that people start designing incentive compensation plans as kind of managers in absentia, right? So they use it to try to discourage certain behaviors, or to punish people for doing certain things that are out of line. Well, that's what sales managers do. Sales managers keep people in line. So the incentive compensation is important. I don't think it's as important as most people think it is. In fact, some research we've seen says that incentive compensation is important, but not for the reasons you think. It's not for the money. It's because it kind of makes it seem a little more fair, that the people who are doing the best job are getting the biggest rewards. It's almost like if you're on a salary and some people are doing great and some aren't, then there's a sense of unfairness to the people who are succeeding. And so incentive compensation is important, but not for the money. I think it's almost more a form of recognition and a form of attaboy, And so
Right.
Just keep it simple, keep it focused on motivating and rewarding, and sales incentives will be great. And I can't say how it relates to training other than, obviously everything needs to be running in the same direction, whether it's training or process or tools or anything else.
Okay, great. We have another question here. Can you tell us about some anecdotes about sales management, either big or small firms that you've encountered? It's a pretty broad question, but.
Oh yeah, well, so
a good story or something.
Yeah, I mean, you should pick up the book, Cracking the Sales Management Code. It's all about sales managers, really. I mean, it's about data and how you manage with processes and data. There's so many stories in there from clients. And actually, I wrote another book called Sales Insanity. I wrote it under a pen name because it's a little bit different, but under Canon Thomas, but you can find it as well. And it's 20 stories of the stupidest things I ever saw in sales. And 10 stories are sales management, and 10 are salespeople behaviors. But I could just go on. The biggest thing with sales management to me is that they're overwhelmed. I think it's the hardest role in a sales force, maybe in the whole organization. You got to be part IT director, part coach, part financial analyst, part therapist, part firefighter. And what sales managers do is they fall into a very reactive stance. And we've worked with company after company where the sales managers are basically going from one fire to the next. And so I will tell one quick story. We were in the training, and we were kind of making this point that sales managers fall into a reactive stance. They don't have control of their day. If they wrote down 10 things they wanted to accomplish in a week, at the end of the week they've done 2 of them because other things got in the way. That's just not good at prioritizing. And so this guy raises a hand. He says, "You know what? When my sales reps call me, I don't even answer the phone." And it was as though an evil sense had come across the room. It's like, because everyone else was going on about, I have an open door policy. Tell my sales reps they can call me at midnight on Sunday if it's important. This guy said, "I don't even answer the phone." Everyone looked at him and he said, hold on a second. He said, "When my sales reps call me, it's usually because they are in the car and have an extra 20 minutes, or something just occurred to them they wanted to call." He said, I don't answer the phone. If they leave a voicemail, I'll check it and call back immediately. He said, most of the time they don't. He said, I wait at least an hour and I'll return their call. And more often than not, they've forgotten why they called. And his attitude was, look, I've got a job, I got things to do, and it's not that I'm neglecting them. You know, they get their coaching, they get their attention, and if they have a real urgent problem, they leave me a voicemail, I call them right back. He said, but they can't own my time. And it was kind of an insightful story in the way that sales managers fall into these reactive stances and they don't get their job done, which is, you know, an important job.
Yeah, that's spot on. So this next one is: sales is full of disappointment and rejection. What's the best antidote to both of these, besides handing out ice cream cones? But
yeah, well, I mean, sales is a tough job, and the
yeah.
way that we look at this is, well, let me share some. So there's a piece of research that was published in Harvard Business Review years ago, in the late 90s even, I think, but it doesn't matter. It's brilliant. And so these researchers studied what motivates salespeople, and they study, you know, rewards, recognition, all that kind of stuff, obviously incentives. The thing they found most motivating to salespeople, this is clarity of task. So if a salesperson has a clear task and they believe in it, they're motivated to do it. You know, so if I think I need to make 10 sales calls this week and I'm going to succeed, I'll do it. And if I fail, what a bummer, you know. But if I make 10 sales calls and I succeed, then I'll make 11 the next week, and I'll make 12 the week after that. And so I think part of management's role, and this is even more important than incentives and motivation, is just to make sure salespeople have confidence in what they're doing. And you know, if they're confident they're doing the right things, they'll handle bad results a little better. You know, if you say, look, Jason, we're going to try something new, right? We're going to make 10 sales calls, and I'm going to come help you, and we're going to plan them. And just, you know, it gives me a little bit of a charge. And if at first I don't succeed, like, Jason, just stay with it, man. We know this is the right thing to do. Just stick with it, and eventually success will come. So I think where people get most discouraged is when they're failing and they don't know what to do. And clarity of task and having people have confidence in the activities they're doing is one thing that will help them fight through kind of demotivating times.
Very helpful. What is the best advice you've given to a sales rep on his or her first day on the job?
Oh, wow. I've never gotten that question before. That's a good one. I would say go interview some customers. You know, I think that when salespeople start, they're so focused on the sales process and the sales technology, and they're trying to get acclimated. You know, I had one client one time. He said, "I don't even train my salespeople how to sell." He said, "I train them how my customers buy." And if they understand how customers buy from them, they're smart enough to figure out the selling part. And so, you know, if I had new salespeople, I'd have them sit down and interview some customers, maybe not theirs, you know, some other customers, but just get them in the mind frame that selling is really just facilitating buying. And if they understand how customers buy, they're smart enough to figure out the selling part.
That's great. That's very helpful for anyone in business. I think that that's our last question. Do you have anything you want to add, or about how people can find you or get more info about your work?
Oh, sure. Well, I'd visit Vantage Point Performance. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. I'd visit vantagepointperformance.com if you're interested in sales management. Again, we have a resource center there. There's just loads of information, videos, and blog posts and articles and links to stuff on the web. And I'm Jason Jordan. You can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily, and I'd be happy to connect with you and see what's going on. So yeah, please try to find us.
Great. And let's please join me in giving a virtual thank you to Jason Jordan, partner at Vantage Point Performance. Great presentation today on the best and worst practices of sales management. I just wanted to let you all know that we have another USPAC business leadership webinar series coming up. The next one is on August 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be about startup growth and acceleration, featuring the founder of KIP, the founder and CEO of KIP, Brian Wong. I actually know Brian, he's great. So that webinar is on August 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern. To register, you can go to uspac.com/events. Please, just want to thank everyone again today for joining, and we will see you again soon. Thank you all so much.